Considering how popular Star Trek's been for more than half a century now, you probably think the original show got a proper conclusion, right? Wrong. The goodbye you're picturing, the found family sailing off into one last adventure, which is the kind of send-off they deserved, mind you, it never happened on television. Hell, they didn't even get a resolution on TV at all. In the original series, lovingly called TOS by fans, the finale was an episode called Turnabout Intruder, and it wasn't written to be a finale at all. It was just a random episode of Enterprise shenanigans. NBC canceled the show mid-production, the cast literally found out on set, and the episode that ended up being the last of TOS is actually ranked among one of the worst in the entire franchise. Oof. Thankfully, they got a much better ending eventually. 6 movies, honorable cameos, and the torch being passed on screen to a whole new generation of crew, but that was years after the fact. Don't worry though, we're going to get into all of that later in this video. Also, this year marks 60 years since Star Trek first started, so has there ever been a more perfect time to talk about how it ended? I think not. So, you know what happens next. Let's engage.
Wagon train to the stars. The pitch NBC almost passed on. Before we get to the ending, you gotta know how close this show was to never existing at all. Gene Roddenberry first pitched Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars. For context, Wagon Train was a mega popular Western at the time. The idea was simple, which made it even more brilliant. It would be an episodic sci-fi series, but instead of a wagon moving across the American frontier, the show would follow a starship traveling through the final frontier of space, dropping in on strange new worlds every week. It also would let you smuggle big ideas like race, war, religion, and morality into what looked like a basic space adventure show. NBC agreed to the concept, from which we got Roddenberry's first pilot, known as The Cage. The network's response was a flat-out no. It called the episode too cerebral, which was a polite way of saying the show was slow as hell and the audience would get bored. And this was back when people still had attention spans. But, and this is a very rare thing, NBC did something unusual. Instead of canning it completely, they ordered a second pilot, giving Roddenberry a near unheard of second chance. Roddenberry made the most of it, and he also brought in William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk to inject energy and swagger into the show. As we now know, this time it worked out. The series was ordered, and Star Trek premiered on NBC on the 8th of September 1966, almost exactly 60 years ago. So, from the very beginning, Star Trek has been a show that survived on second chances. Keep that in mind because it basically sets up the story for the entire franchise. A hit that never felt like one. So this is something that surprised me, and I bet it surprised a lot of people, but Star Trek was never actually a big ratings star. Never in Season 3, never in 2, and never even in Season 1. Sure, we know it now as this colossal cultural monolith, something people know the name of even if they've never seen a single episode, but that really wasn't the case when it first hit the airwaves. I mean, at best, it was a respectable mid-tier show, and the issue was that it was also a really costly production. And that's pretty much the crux of it. Star Trek was a costly show to produce. Those alien worlds, the optical effects, the model work, the detailed makeup, it all added up to a lot of moolah, and it was too pricey for the era. Too much money was being funneled into a show that wasn't getting enough views, which meant it was becoming exactly the kind of show a network starts eyeing when renewal season comes a-knockin', which means that Star Trek wasn't fighting for its life only at the end, it was in survival mode for pretty much the entire run. Right from the start, TOS was always one bad ratings period away from the chopping block, and the network made sure everyone involved knew it, which brings us to the first time it nearly died. Almost cancelled after Season 2, the letter campaign that brought a reprieve. By early 1968, after a second season of lukewarm numbers, NBC was done, and it really did pull the plug. Almost. The reason for that almost wasn't a change of heart, as if. What actually saved the show is one of the most famous fan stories in television history. Two superfans, Bo and John Trimble, launched a grassroots letter-writing campaign called Save Star Trek. Nowadays, we're pretty used to fan campaigns to try to save shows, but can you imagine that in the 1960s, before the internet? That's commitment. Bo had access to a science fiction convention mailing list of a few thousand people, and her plan was simple. Write to NBC, then get 10 friends to write to, and ask them to get 10 more. And geez, it worked. The campaign snowballed to seriously ridiculous proportions. Just so you understand, between December 1967 and March 1968, that's just 4 months by the way, NBC was buried under a reported 116,000 letters. Apparently, 52,000 of them showed up just in February. One NBC executive apparently described looking out of his office window in Burbank and seeing mail trucks lined up right to the end of the road. There were even demonstrations on college campuses. And it worked spectacularly because NBC again did something it rarely ever did. It went on the air and announced directly to the viewers that Star Trek would return for a third season. Funnily enough, they also asked people to please stop writing in. The fans gave it everything they had and they saved the show. As always though, be careful what you wish for because saving it ended up having some very nasty strings attached. The catch in the reprieve. Every good story needs a twist, and here comes the one for the original series. Sure, fans got their third season, but the version of Season 3 they got was set up to fail almost from the start. The reason for that was a chain of very specific decisions which we're going to get into right now. First, Roddenberry. He'd been fighting NBC for 2 solid years over budgets, over content, over the network's constant meddling, and by this point, he was worn down and bitter. I don't blame him. Sometimes the fight just isn't worth it after a point. And then came the breaking point. After the third season deal came through, Roddenberry had reportedly been promised a decent time slot, but NBC moved the show to Fridays at 10 p.m., which was a graveyard shift so notorious it had an actual name in the industry, the death slot. 10 p.m. on a Friday meant the show's core audience of younger viewers were, out living their lives, and the youngest viewers, aka children, were asleep. Roddenberry was understandably furious, and he basically walked out. He did keep his executive producer title, but otherwise he stepped back from the day-to-day running of the show in everything but name. In his place, the show got a producer called Fred Freeberger, who inherited a show he hadn't built. More importantly, the budget had been slashed, with the cost falling to roughly $178,000 per episode compared to the $196,000 they'd had for Season 1. Less money, a worse time slot, and smaller viewership, and the guy who'd started the show and who had been the heart and soul of production had given up. You didn't need a crystal ball to see what was coming next. A season built to lose. Season 3 wasn't bad, but because of all those constraints, it was predictably more of a miss than a hit. Because of the reduced budget, you got more episodes set entirely aboard the ship, or more Monster of the Week plots you could shoot on existing sets, with fewer gorgeous location shoots and elaborate alien planets that had made the earlier seasons feel so cinematic, even for a TV show. A lot of the original writing staff had drifted away following Roddenberry's exit, which meant the creativity pretty much lost its spark. Now, look, Fred Freeberger has been a fan punching bag for decades, but I want to be fair here because it's not entirely deserved. Nichelle Nichols, the actress who portrayed Uhura, defended him directly, pinning the decline squarely on the budget rather than the man. As she put it, Star Trek's demise became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I can assure you that is exactly as it was meant to be. In other words, the network deliberately produced a season designed to underperform so it could justify canceling the show. And yet, even hamstrung like that, Season 3 produced real landmarks that became part of pop culture history. To pick just one example, which happens to be one of the more famous ones, Plato's Stepchildren featured the Kirk-Uhura kiss, frequently cited as one of the first interracial kisses on American television, a remarkably daring moment for 1968. So the season wasn't creatively bankrupt, it was simply set up for failure. The day the cast found out. And sadly, fail it did, in about the most tactless way possible. Let's picture this scene. It's the 6th of January, 1969, a Monday, and everyone's on set filming an episode called Turnabout Intruder. For the first few days of that shoot, the crew actually had been prepping for the season's planned 25th episode, The Joy Machine, which was a big deal, especially to William Shatner, because it was going to be his directorial debut and a personal milestone. You can almost smell the trouble brewing. That very Monday, mid-production, Gene Roddenberry walked onto set and told Shatner directly that NBC had canceled the show. Star Trek was over, which meant that Shatner's directing debut was over before it even started. Now, part of the lore here is that Shatner was reportedly ill with the flu that day and had just been told his show was dead, but he still finished the scene as if nothing had happened and even made jokes during production. And there also happened to be a visitor on set that day, and this is what makes everyone's eyes nearly burst out of their sockets. It was a young O.J. Simpson, long before notoriety, back when he was just starting to dabble in acting, watching from the sidelines. Roddenberry, gesturing at Shatner soldiering through the take despite everything, turned to a young Simpson and said, "You have just seen an actor at work." The rest of the cast and crew were told through a formal announcement from the associate producer at the end of the day. Filming wrapped on the 9th, and that was that. Also, a little detail to add some salt to the wound is that, as they were shooting those final scenes, the Enterprise sets around them were being physically dismantled. That's brutal. Turnabout Intruder, the finale nobody planned to write. So let's talk about Turnabout Intruder, the episode that totally by accident became the end of Star Trek TOS. And I'll level with you here, it's not particularly good. It's actually frequently ranked among the very worst episodes the franchise ever produced, and it's not just because fans were fuming that this was the last one. The plot is a body swap story, pretty on brand for the original Trek. Kirk encounters Dr. Janice Lester, his former lover, who resents Kirk because, as a woman, she was denied command of a starship. Compelling stuff, right? And pretty bold for an era when women's rights were still a heavily contested issue. Instead of seeking revenge, she uses an alien machine to swap bodies with Kirk, trapping his consciousness in her body while she takes over his, and with it, command of the Enterprise. The rest of the episode follows Kirk, trapped in Lester's body, as he tries to convince the crew that the captain on the bridge is an imposter. Well, it might look progressive from one angle, and sure, you can marvel that they were tackling women's rights in the 60s, you can't forget that Star Trek takes place in the 23rd century, which is exactly why it's aged so badly. The whole episode hinges on the concept that Starfleet doesn't let women be captains, which means in the Star Trek universe, they accepted aliens and starships and teleportation, but a woman in charge was a step too far. They didn't even let Dr. Lester be capable while pretending to be Kirk. She spends the whole episode giving increasingly erratic orders. There's some horrible irony at play here that a show celebrated for its forward-thinking politics went out on its single most regressive note. I don't even know how that makes sense, since in the original Roddenberry pilot, the first officer was a woman. Also, it just sucks as a finale, which makes sense because it was never written to be one. There's no grand mission, no farewell, not even a nice shot of the whole crew looking out at space, and the bad luck didn't stop there. The episode was originally scheduled to air on the 28th of March, 1969, but NBC replaced it with a special news report because former President Dwight D. Eisenhower had just died that day. The finale just couldn't catch a break. It remained shelved for 2 months before finally airing on June 3rd in a brand new time slot to, unsurprisingly, poor ratings. It was a delayed and disappointing farewell for a show that deserved so much better. But to be objective, it's not all bad. Like, Shatner was damn near at his best in it. In fact, the fans who ran the campaign to save the show, Joe and John Trimble, even said that the episode was very good. It might have won an Emmy for William Shatner. Critic Scott Mance pointed to the episode's final moments as weirdly perfect, if totally unintentional. There is something somewhat apropos about the last words of the last episode, Turnabout Intruder. Her life could have been as rich as any woman's, if only, and then Kirk walks off. Ignoring the part about womankind, if only is a pretty perfect accidental farewell for a show that ended midway through production and well before its time. From canceled to cult phenomenon. That cancellation should have been the end of Star Trek. I mean, canceling something literally means that it's over. Instead, it turned out to be the beginning of something much bigger. When a show gets canceled, it usually just vanishes and maybe returns from obscurity a few decades later because some popular influencer started to watch it. But Star Trek had done just enough episodes, 79 across 3 seasons FYI, to be viable for syndication, which is what it's called when local TV stations buy the rights to rerun a show. And in syndication, Star Trek exploded. Freed from NBC and the death slot, the reruns landed in the afternoons and early evenings, right where youngsters and kids could actually watch them. And they did, obsessively, over and over. Through the 1970s, a show that had been canceled for low ratings became a genuine cultural phenomenon on its second lap. This was the era that birthed the very first Star Trek conventions, with thousands of fans packing into hotels to celebrate a show that network television had thrown away. Gene Roddenberry, as you might have guessed, relished this vindication. He loved to tell a story from years later about a demographics expert who went to NBC after the cancellation. In Roddenberry's words, a fellow from demographics came to NBC and said, "Congratulations, you've just got rid of your most important and successful program." They didn't know what he was talking about. Slowly, really slowly, but surely, they and the wider studio, Paramount, started to realize what they had given up. The animated sequel almost nobody remembers. The first sign that Paramount had noticed Star Trek still made money was in 1973, and this is something that most fans tend to forget: Star Trek, the animated series. Running on NBC from 1973 to 74 for just 22 episodes, this Saturday morning cartoon was in fact the fourth season the original crew never got. It wasn't just a cheap cash-in grab with random voices that animated sequels usually are these days, because nearly the entire original cast returned to voice their characters. There's a nice story here. When the animation studio, Filmation, initially tried to trim the budget by cutting some of the supporting cast, Leonard Nimoy reportedly refused to come aboard unless Nichelle Nichols, George Takei, and Walter Koenig were all included. Nimoy, understanding exactly how important these characters and this diverse crew were, effectively used his own clout to protect his castmates' place at the table. And the animated series was no throwaway either. It won the franchise its first ever competitive series Emmy, a daytime Emmy for Outstanding Children's Series in 1975. Despite all that, it gets overlooked, even though it was the closest thing the original crew ever got to a real continuation, and it kept the lights on while plans for something bigger began. Also, we got some pretty good memes out of it. Almost a new TV show became a movie instead. So this bigger plan, it wasn't a movie at all, at first. After all, Star Trek began as a TV show, which was why, by the mid-1970s, Paramount was seriously developing a full-blown revival series called Star Trek Phase 2. This was going to be the flagship show for a proposed fourth American television network the studio wanted to launch. They got a long ways down the road too, reassembling most of the original cast, building sets, commissioning scripts. It was really happening. And then 1977 happened, which, as you might already know, means Star Wars. A New Hope ruled at the box office, followed by Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and suddenly the entertainment industry had even more reason to believe there was serious money in big-screen sci-fi spectacle. Paramount had already begun developing a Star Trek movie, but the success of Star Wars and Close Encounters helped strengthen the case for taking the franchise to the big screen, and Phase 2 was ultimately transformed into a feature film. That film became Star Trek the Motion Picture, released in 1979, reuniting the entire original cast on the big screen for the first time. It was slow and cerebral, like the original pilot, and it's a pretty divisive movie even to this day, but it made money, which was what the company wanted. More importantly, it proved the crew still had the magic, and it meant there was a big screen future for them. The TV show that died in 1969 had become, improbably, a movie franchise. That was actually exactly what Roddenberry had been hoping for when the show was originally canceled, so it all worked out in the end. 6 movies, one real goodbye. It was through this film franchise, which had 6 films from 1979 to 1991, that the crew finally got the proper send-off television had denied them. The second film is considered by many the high point, even though Roddenberry was forced out of the creative chair. We're talking about 1982's The Wrath of Khan, an emotional and thrilling story that ended with the death of Spock as he sacrificed himself to save the ship. It's still regarded as one of the greatest Star Trek stories ever told, in any format, by pretty much any fan in any decade. That death set up 2 films. First, The Search for Spock in 1984, where, as the title suggests, the crew defied orders to recover and resurrect their fallen friend at real cost to themselves. This one was also directed by Leonard Nimoy, making it extra special. 1986's The Voyage Home, also directed by Nimoy, which happens to be my personal favorite, is the famous one where they travel back to 1980s San Francisco to save some whales, and this one lightened the mood and became the biggest hit of the 6. The Final Frontier in 1989 is generally considered the weak link, even though Shatner directed that one, but it led to the one that actually matters for the purposes of our video today, 1991's The Undiscovered Country. The film was consciously made as the original crew's final voyage together, and it's worth digging into the background for why this works as a beautiful send-off. Although Nimoy didn't direct this one, the story was his brainchild, and he took direct inspiration from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the thawing of the Cold War. This historical event is paralleled almost perfectly in the Star Trek universe. A catastrophe on a Klingon moon cripples the Klingon Empire, leaving it with roughly 50 years to survive unless it makes peace with the Federation, its bitter enemy for almost a century. So, the great warmongering rivals of the entire franchise are suddenly, awkwardly pushed toward peace, and Kirk, of all people, is chosen to escort the Klingon Chancellor to talks, despite his deep hatred of the Klingons after they killed his son David in the search for Spock. That personal grudge makes the emotional momentum even more worth it. Then, the Chancellor is assassinated, and Kirk and McCoy are framed for it, convicted, and shipped off to a frozen Klingon prison called Rura Penthe. The crew back on the Enterprise, led by Spock, has to prove it was a setup, and they uncover a conspiracy that goes deep. Rogue officers from Starfleet, the Klingons, and even the Romulans, all working together to torpedo the peace deal because they're terrified of a future without their old hatreds. It's a mystery, a prison break, and a chase all at once, building to a race to the Kitomer Peace Conference to stop a second assassination, this time of the Federation president. The crew beams there just in time. Scotty takes down the gunman and the peace holds. The undiscovered country of the title is a phrase from Hamlet, and it turns out to mean the future itself, the thing people fear most because it means change. I mean, how perfect is that for a final story? And then comes the goodbye. Kirk, having finally let go of his own prejudice, gives one last speech and shares a moving conversation with the late Chancellor's daughter about restoring faith between old enemies. The Enterprise is ordered home to be decommissioned, but Kirk doesn't obey. Instead, he cheekily tells the helm to fly on. His final captain's log muses about the legacy of the Enterprise and talks about how this ship and crew have done their duty for the last time, and that the ones who come after them must boldly go where no one has gone before. And then, with a beautiful flourish, the lead actors' signatures appear on screen, one after another, literally signing off. After 25 years, this was the crew autographing their own farewell. About damn time, too. Forget Turnabout Intruder. If you want the real ending to the story of this crew, look no further. Though it's important to note that the film doesn't just close a door, it also opens one. The Undiscovered Country ends the original crew's story, sure, but it also explicitly sets up the universe of the future. That fragile Federation Klingon peace forged at Kitomer is the very foundation the next era of Star Trek is built on. By the time of The Next Generation, set some 80 years later, Klingons have been serving in Starfleet as allies, which is something that would have been unthinkable back in Kirk's day. So this film, while bidding goodbye to the original crew, also becomes the bridge to everything that came next. The franchise actually made this handoff literal just 3 years later, which takes us to our next point. Passing the torch. Kirk's death and the crew's return throughout the Next Generation era. But the franchise wasn't done with the original crew yet. By 1991, there was a whole new Star Trek on the air, Next Generation, with a new ship and a new captain, Jean-Luc Picard. The studio wanted to formally connect the old to the new and bring back any fans who'd quit when the original crew signed off, so in 1994's Star Trek Generations, they did something daring. They brought Captain Kirk into the Next Generation era and then killed him off on screen, having him die helping Picard save a planet. It was an obvious passing of the torch, the original captain giving his life so the new one could carry on and save new worlds. Some fans loved the poignancy of this moment, others felt Kirk deserved something bigger and grander, but the symbolism was unmistakable. And then came a whole run of cameos designed to weave the original crew through the newer shows. DeForest Kelley's McCoy appeared, aged and delightful, in the very first episode of The Next Generation, Encounter at Farpoint in 1987, blessing the new ship. Mark Leonard's Sarek, Spock's father, appeared in the episodes Sarek and Unification, while Nimoy's Spock himself returned in the latter, now operating as a diplomat in Picard's era. James Doohan's Scotty had a great time in Relics in 1992, an old engineer stranded out of his time. Then in 1996, Deep Space Nine pulled off a technical marvel with Trials and Tribulations, digitally inserting its cast into footage from the iconic original 1967 episode The Trouble with Tribbles, letting a modern crew brush shoulders with Kirk himself via archive footage. And right at the end of the prequel series Enterprise, in its 2005 finale, they even used Shatner's archived voice for a Kirk log entry. Over and over, no matter how many decades pass, the franchise keeps reaching back to make sure the original crew remained part of everything new. The Kelvin Timeline. How the 2009 reboot kept the original crew canon. By the late 2000s, Paramount wanted to reboot Star Trek for a new generation with younger actors playing Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Uhura, Sulu, and Chekhov. The obvious risk with any reboot is that it can feel like an erasure, wiping away the stuff fans loved and replacing it with a shinier, newer copy. Star Trek 2009, directed by J.J. Abrams, solved this conundrum pretty damn well, and the key was Leonard Nimoy. In this film, Nimoy returned as the original Prime Spock, now an old man, and the film's plot used time travel to create a new branching timeline, later dubbed the Kelvin timeline, where the younger versions of the crew could have fresh adventures, and the sandbox was fresh to play in. Like, pretty genius stuff because they didn't have to overwrite the original continuity, this timeline just ran alongside it. There's an incredible moment where old Spock gives the Vulcan salute to a young Spock on screen, which I think was the reboot's way of saying, we're not replacing what you loved, we're honoring it and doing something new at the same time. The original Prime timeline itself kept going, with later shows like Picard, which gave Patrick Stewart's captain his own long-delayed farewell, and Strange New Worlds, which returned to the era of the original series and is now airing its 4th season. The universe just kept expanding outwards, but it never turned its back on where it came from. Did Star Trek ever really get to end? Let's unpack everything that's happened to this saga. First and foremost, in 1969 and on TV, Star Trek got an ending that nobody involved wanted, a body swap episode that went against the progressive utopia the world of Star Trek is supposed to be, and then it was replaced by a news broadcast of a president's death and shuffled out to weak ratings on some random Tuesday. The show was killed in every way. But then the franchise spent the next quarter of a century building the ending it actually deserved, and it did so in installments. So which is the real finale of Star Trek? There's loads of answers, and all of them are right. Technically, Turnabout Intruder was the finale because it was the last episode of the original TV run. But also, The Undiscovered Country from 1991, designed as the crew's final farewell, where they got to fly off and sign off on their own terms, is the finale for those characters. And I mean, Captain Kirk's death in Generations also counts because that was the moment the torch was physically passed to a new captain. Frankly, when it comes to Star Trek, ending and finale aren't even the right words because the franchise just keeps regenerating into new shows and new crews and new centuries, which means that the answer is no. Star Trek has never really ended. Like, how could something this huge, this sprawling, this beloved, which has lasted for 60 years and is still going strong, ever end? It doesn't seem possible to me, and maybe the most Star Trek thing about Star Trek is that it refuses to stay dead. That said, I'd love to hear from you. What do you believe to be the show's true ending? The accident NBC threw at them back in 1969, or was it the goodbye the crew and the fans spent 25 years building for themselves? And honestly, do you think Star Trek can ever really end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe this video if you enjoyed it, because that's the best way to see more videos like it. Also, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time. But until then, and I think you know what I'm going to say here, live long and prosper.